War reveals many things: weapons, power, fear, but most importantly, it reveals who your real friends are. Iran always said it had many powerful friends: Russia, China, North Korea, some angry politicians in Europe, a whole anti-America club. But when the missiles started flying, something strange happened. Everyone suddenly discovered a new word: diplomacy. Translation? Good luck, Iran. Britain used to have a simple rule. If America sneezes, London brings tissues. If America fights a war, Britain shows up. But this time, things were different. Prime Minister Keir Starmer said no when Washington first asked to use British bases for the strikes. He said Britain needed a proper plan, international law, no regime change from the skies, which is political language for let's wait and see who wins. Donald Trump was not impressed. He mocked Starmer and said, "This is not Winston Churchill." Translation: Britain used to be brave. Then something funny happened. As the war started going badly for Iran, London quickly changed its mind. Britain allowed U.S. forces to use its bases for defensive operations. Warships were discussed. Carriers were prepared. Suddenly, Britain looked much more interested. But Trump had already noticed the timing. He posted, "We don't need people that join wars after we've already won." Ouch! Why Starmer suddenly changed his statements? Because if the U.S. wins this war, there will be contracts, reconstruction, oil deals, influence, and Britain definitely doesn't want to watch that party from outside the room. France always tries to be the adult in the room. When the Iran war started, President Emmanuel Macron immediately called for an emergency UN meeting, because nothing stops missiles faster than a meeting in New York. Macron also said the strikes were outside international law, which is French diplomatic language for, technically, we don't approve. But then he added something interesting. Iran's actions were also destabilizing the region. So France criticized the war and criticized Iran at the same time. That takes talent. But the real French move happened quietly. While Paris was calling for diplomacy, French warships started moving. Jets were repositioned. Military forces were reinforced. Because France believes in two kinds of diplomacy: regular diplomacy and diplomacy with aircraft carriers. Macron even said France would help Gulf countries defend themselves if Iran attacked. So France's position became very clear. Publicly, war is dangerous and must stop. Privately, move the ships, just in case. Which means Macron is playing three roles at the same time: the philosopher, the diplomat, and the admiral. Macron wants peace, but he also wants to make sure France is sitting at the table when the war is over, preferably at the head of the table, with a long speech, and maybe a reconstruction contract. Germany used to have a very simple foreign policy: avoid war, avoid drama, avoid anything that reminds people of 1940. For decades, Germany preferred diplomacy, trade, and very careful speeches. But the world has changed. First Ukraine, now Iran. And suddenly, Germany is rediscovering something interesting: alliances matter. So Friedrich Merz flew to Washington to meet Trump right after the war started, which is diplomatic language for let's make sure we're on the winning team. Merz also avoided criticizing the strikes before the meeting, because nothing ruins a White House visit faster than insulting the host. Then Merz said something that shocked a lot of people. He said Israel was doing the dirty work for us, which is one of the most honest sentences ever spoken in European diplomacy, because Europe has worried about Iran's nuclear program for years. But actually confronting Iran? That is much easier when someone else is doing it. So Germany's new strategy looks like this. Publicly, restraint, diplomacy, stability. Privately, call Washington. Because Germany understands something very important. If the world is becoming more dangerous, Berlin wants to stand closer to the United States, not further away. After all, Germany spent decades trying to become Europe's economic leader. Now, Merz wants Germany to become something else again, America's most important partner in Europe, which means Germany is quietly returning to its favorite place in geopolitics, right next to Washington, preferably before the victory speeches start. Then there is Spain. Spain took the boldest position in Europe. Pedro Sanchez simply said, "No to war." Not maybe. Not, "Let's discuss." Just, no. Spain even refused to allow the United States to use American bases on Spanish soil for attacks on Iran, which made Washington unhappy. Trump threatened to cut off trade with Spain. But Sanchez didn't back down. He said Spain would not be complicit in something bad for the world. So Spain became the loudest anti-war voice in Europe. But then something interesting happened. Spain also sent one of its most advanced frigates to the eastern Mediterranean to join a European naval force protecting Cyprus, which means Spain's policy looks something like this. Public message: we oppose the war. Military reality: send a ship, but call it defensive. Then there is Canada. Canada's position on the Iran war is complicated. On the first day, Mark Carney said, Canada supports stopping Iran from getting nuclear weapons, which sounded like support for the strikes. But then he added, Canada was not consulted, and the war was a failure of the international order, which sounded like criticism. Then came the next statement. Canada might still join the conflict if allies ask for help, which sounded like support again. So Canada's position now looks something like this. Day 1, yes. Day 2, no. Day 3, maybe. Even Canada's own opposition politicians joked about the message. We support it. We're upset about it. We think it's bad. But we might join. That is not foreign policy. That is diplomatic yoga. Because Canada has a difficult job. It wants to look independent from Washington. But it also does not want to anger Washington. So Canada's strategy becomes criticize the war, support the goal, possibly send help, and hope nobody asks too many questions. Because in modern geopolitics, Canada is what diplomats call a middle power, which means Canada cannot start the war, but it also cannot ignore the war. So Ottawa's message to the world is simple. We are deeply concerned. We support our allies, and we will decide our position tomorrow. Now let's talk about China. China always says it supports peace and stability and dialogue, which is true, because stability is very good for business. China buys huge amounts of oil from the Middle East, and war is bad for oil routes, especially one very important place, the Strait of Hormuz. If that closes, half of Asia's oil gets stuck. So China did what China usually does. It released a statement, a very serious statement, a very concerned statement, a very long statement. And then it did absolutely nothing. No ships, no military help, no rescue mission, just diplomacy. Because China prefers wars that happen far away from its trade routes. Russia is another interesting friend. Russia loudly condemned the strikes. It said the attacks were illegal. It demanded peace. But there was one small problem. Russia is already busy. Very busy. Ukraine, Sanctions, economy, military production. Opening another war? Not a great idea. So Russia chose a very clever strategy: support Iran. With speeches, lots of speeches, very strong speeches, from a very safe distance. Because if there's one thing Russia understands, it's that oil prices go up during wars, and Russia sells oil. So from Moscow's perspective, this war is terrible, tragic, dangerous, and also quite profitable. Now we arrive at the most dramatic supporter, North Korea. North Korea called the attacks illegal. It condemned America. It condemned Israel. It condemned imperialism. It condemned everything, which is impressive, because North Korea condemns something every Tuesday. But in terms of actual help, none. No ships, no planes, no missiles, just a very angry press release, which in North Korea is basically a national sport. Across Asia, the reaction was different. Japan, South Korea, India. They weren't cheering, they weren't condemning loudly either. They were worried. Because Asia has its own problem, China. And if the United States gets stuck in a long Middle East war, Asia starts asking a scary question: who protects us? Some military systems might even be moved from Asia to the Middle East, which makes everyone in Asia slightly uncomfortable, because Asia prefers American power, closer to China, not closer to Iran. So the war revealed something very interesting. Iran believed it had powerful friends, but when the shooting started, China offered diplomacy, Russia offered speeches, North Korea offered anger, Europe offered caution, and everyone else offered concern. Lots of concern, because in international politics, friendship works a little differently. Countries don't have friends, they have interests, and when interests change, friends suddenly become very quiet.
Thank you for watching Pastcast, where the past echoes through today. If you enjoyed the satire, scrolls, and scandals, like, subscribe, and ring the bell before the next empire falls.